to make an urgent statement in respect of the ongoing litigation to the Department of Health and Social Care, Dr Rosalind Ranson, for the Chief Minister.
Mr Speaker, almost exactly 12 months ago, I determined it was in the public interest for me to respond to the liability findings of the Employment and Equality Tribunal, considering the Dr Rosalind Ranson case, despite at the time the matter remaining sub judice. Last week, Mr Speaker, the Tribunal published its decision regarding the compensation for Dr Ranson, and this has understandably brought again to the fore the matters that in May 2022 honourable members were rightly concerned to see addressed. Even today as I speak, the case remains technically sub judice as set out in standing orders. Mr Speaker, I regard the matter of sub judice as requiring review and clarity, and will be writing to the standing orders of the Committee of Tynwald accordingly. But I'm speaking today against this backdrop because I feel it is in the national interest to do so, and because it is of vital importance that the actions that we put in train last year continue to be recognised and implemented. Indeed, I want to make it clear and remind everyone that last year I set out a robust response for the substantial findings of the Tribunal. I was clear that the liability judgment of the Employment Tribunal in May 2022 that was determined in favour of Dr Rosalind Ranson made uncomfortable reading. Regrettably, it did not reflect well on the professionalism of our public service, irrespective of the fact that the core actions that laid the foundations of this tribunal happened during a period of national crisis. I was clear that the liability judgment had raised a number of substantive questions regarding government performance and culture, and had understandably damaged confidence in government. I was clear about our deep discomfort that we felt with the evidence and findings of the tribunal as set out in the liability judgment, and I acknowledged our shortcomings. I was clear that we needed to make changes to government, structural changes, cultural changes, and organisational changes, because we cannot retain the status quo. Indeed, we have been taking action over the past 12 months to effect that and to deliver meaningful change. Mr Speaker, we have looked at governance, the structure of the public service accountability, and how senior officers are overseen and held to account. This has included an independent review of the role of the Chief Secretary and how it interacts with Chief Executives. As we speak, we are in the process of recruiting for the new Chief Executive Officer of the Isle of Man Government with a refined job description that emphasises the need to properly performance manage chief officers. We have put in oversight through the creation of an Operations Performance Board, and its work is now underway. The Operational Performance Board brings greater support and guidance to the Chief Executive Officer and provides for more visibility and robust input into the problem-solving decisions across departments. We have examined how non-executives can form part of governance arrangements in departments and updated the government code accordingly. The opportunity exists now for board advisors to give advice and support on the operational implications and effectiveness of policy proposals, focusing on getting policy translated into results. These non-executive directors will operate according to national and recognised precepts of good corporate governance in business, leadership, effectiveness, accountability and sustainability. Enhanced department boards need to be able to challenge, advise on and supervise 5 main key areas of strategic clarity, commercial sense, talented people, results focus and management information. Mr Speaker, we have strengthened whistleblowing policies in the public sector. We have commissioned an independent review of the Office of Human Resources, which is due to report shortly. And there is the ongoing Great Place to Work programme across the public service, with work streams refocusing in making government an employer that looks after its employees. Finally, Mr Speaker, we now have a confidential integrity line service up and running that allows confidential and anonymous, if wished, reporting of concerns for staff across the entire public service. This work is well and truly underway, Mr Speaker, and I remind you of this substantial response because it was imperative last May when the liability judgment was published, that we acted, and this government remains committed to the delivery of this change. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, although my response at the time highlighted my serious concerns at the findings of the tribunal, my statement at that point was constrained by the sub judice rules that I have referenced. I feel therefore today it is entirely appropriate for me to go further and express not only my deep regret that Dr Ranson was subjected to such unprofessional and damaging behaviours whilst in post as the medical director, but also to offer my deepest apologies for the harm she has experienced and which the tribunal has recognised in their liability judgment and has now reflected in the compensation award made in the quantum judgment.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, Dr Ranson in her statement said this must not be the end. I entirely agree. In fact, the striving to reach excellence in governance, management, performance and productivity must always continue. And as I have said, there are various initiatives which have been put in place following the liability hearing last May, which continue today. But there are a number of ways in which this now must continue to be accomplished. Firstly, the root causes of this matter were laid in the heat of the battle against COVID. When I spoke last May, I quoted the tribunal's words, which were that this decision is not an investigation into the way in which the Manx government handled the COVID-19 pandemic. As honourable members will now know, that review is well and truly underway and is being conducted entirely independently by Kate Brunner, KC, who has full access to all records and who is also taking evidence from those who were directly involved, as well as seeking submissions from the members of the public. Ms Brunner is due to report her conclusions and identify any recommendations for consideration to Tynwald by the 31st of December 2023. The advice and authority of Dr Ranson, the flow of information, access to ministers, the command and management structures in place must now be a matter for the COVID inquiry and Kate Brunner, KC. It is not for me or anyone else to tell Ms Brunner how to conduct her inquiry, but I point out that the Tynwald approved terms of reference for the review provide that if any time the independent chair considers that a specific area should be subject to a more formal public inquiry, the chair may make such a recommendation to Tynwald in their report. Secondly, Mr Speaker, questions have been raised regarding the approach to litigation in relation to which there has been a significant amount of criticism, reporting and speculation. Mr Speaker, it is vital that the public have confidence in the manner in which government conducts itself when facing judicial challenge. It must have confidence that government is conducting itself properly and with the appropriate advice and decision making in place. The Council of Ministers recognises that this matter needs to be addressed, but also recognises that this is not a straightforward matter. It is an area which requires specialist legal knowledge. I can therefore inform you today that the Council of Ministers intends to recommend to Tynwald that a further independent assessment needs to be undertaken into the Department's management of the tribunal process, and that an appropriate independent senior member of the bar is most likely needed to undertake this work. It is clear that the majority of the tribunal's criticisms focus on the conduct of the department during the liability hearing, and this will need to be the key focus of any inquiry. Thirdly, Mr Speaker, we must ensure that our public service works to the highest standards of governance and integrity. We must have governance that ensures we do not rely solely on single individuals at senior levels to such a degree where they could become a point of failure. All our public servants are entitled to a working environment where accountability and mutual respect coexist. I set out a clear Council of Ministers response to improve governance and culture last year, and we remain committed to improving governance and culture throughout the public sector. Mr Speaker, the findings of the Tribunal in May 2022 in their liability judgment and the subsequent award of compensation are of deep concern, and I apologise again to Dr Ranson. This is not the end of the matter, and we must all continue the work underway to improve governance, performance and culture, and of course strive to nurture and protect our greatest asset, our people.
One moment, the contents of that statement are open to questions. Mrs. Christian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Chief Minister's statement this morning and thank him for clarity and concise information. And I welcome the announcement of an independent review. Could the Chief Minister confirm if the independent assessment will review the actions and advice of the Attorney General's Office and also political involvement? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I think I was clear in my statement, Mr. Speaker, that we will recommend to Tynwald that an independent review is undertaken, and I would suggest on that basis we will work closely with Tynwald to ensure that the terms of reference are appropriately addressed.
Further questions to Glover?
Does the Chief Minister believe that this is indeed enough to restore public trust, which currently is fractured in him, his administration, and indeed this place, Tynwald Court? Is this going to be enough to restore public trust?
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, what we have to do is to put everything into context and remember that the foundations of this particular case were laid well and truly during a period of national crisis. Mr. Speaker, it is absolutely clear from the Tribunal's findings that they were not judging the COVID response, but it is clear also from the Tribunal's findings that they let the record show the extraordinary hours put in by the DHSC, Minister Ashford, and almost all the medical professionals and all the health service employees involved in protecting the community during the pandemic. Working beyond midnight and resuming before dawn seemed to become a norm for the Minister, Miss Magson, Dr Ranson, and of course many others. Mr. Speaker, the root causes of the Tribunal itself need to be tackled, and that is what this Council is set out to do based on the findings that were delivered in the liability hearings. I have already expressed our deep concern. I believe we acted appropriately. We set out a very strong response last May. I have covered again the critical points of that response, and we're going to continue to work appropriately to make sure that there is better governance and performance culture in this government and across the public service. Mr. Speaker, I would also add, I doubt there will not be another employment tribunal in the future. I doubt that there will not be another case that involves some form of inappropriate behaviours. In a workforce of 7,500 people, that's almost impossible to foresee. What is lacking, and what has been lacking, is appropriate governance and process. The fact is, the foundations of this, as outlined in the liability hearings, really became because of conflict between two very senior executives, the Chief Executive Officer and the Medical Director, and then those behaviours manifested itself outside of the direct emergency, leading, of course, to the outcomes that the Tribunal eventually found. So yes, it is important, of course, Mr. Speaker, to keep working. It is important that we continue to strive. The actions that we've taken are appropriate. And yes, the public can have confidence that this government is tackling the core issues and is going to work to ensure that we have a better service level, culture level and professional level throughout the public service.
Further supplementary, Mrs. Christian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Chief Minister give an idea of when he will be bringing this to Tynwald? Is it next week or in May and June? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chief Minister.
Well, we need to bring it forward as quickly as possible. I note that, of course, the Honourable Member has brought forward a supplementary order paper seconded by Mr Glover, and clearly we will be discussing matters further in Tynwald next week.
Supplementary questions from Morehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the statement and would like to ask why it's taken almost a week to provide this update. That was a long time. But also, in terms of reassuring the human rights care, could we have some word on that, please? I know a lot of people are concerned about what's going on, and I think some reassurance would be appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I just missed that final, I missed probably a word or two from that second part about management. Kindly repeat that, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, with regard to the employees at Manx Care, can you provide some reassurance about the situation? I believe many of them would appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Just in terms of timescales, I think it is important, Mr. Speaker, that we deal with matters appropriately. Whilst I recognise, of course, considerable public pressure, these matters do need careful consideration. There is an ongoing issue around timescales and appeal processes, and it is important that some time was taken to reflect and ensure that we were conducting our business properly. I would suggest to everybody that it is incumbent, no matter what the heightened state of public engagement, that we conduct our business in a proper legal and lawful manner, and that includes how we go about assessing further impacts, but also how we go about treating our staff. Dr Rosalind Ranson was treated unfairly and maliciously, as clear from the liability findings. We must make sure that we continue to conduct ourselves properly in terms of the way that we are going about ensuring that governance is enforced in the public sector, treating our employees properly and learning the lessons that have come from this review, and ensuring that a proper standard of governance professionalism is applied to all these circumstances, and that single points of failure are quickly identified, and those around that single point of failure are aware of the conduct of that particular individual and the impact that is potentially having.
Question, Mr. Glover.
We're reminded of the Chief Minister made reference in his statement to the independent COVID inquiry, and pointed out that Tim will of course approve the terms and conditions of that, and that the independent chair can consider that a specific area that should be the subject of a more formal public inquiry can be made. Does the Chief Minister think we're at that point now?
Chief Minister.
Well, I think it's absolutely important that I do not interfere with conduct of the inquiry. I have every confidence that Kate Casey is perfectly capable of assessing what, if anything, needs to be taken in the public arena. I do not intend to labour the point. What I've done is contextualise that the foundations of this case, the way that Dr Ranson was treated, the whistleblowing disclosures, were fundamentally formed during that period of intense national crisis, and that the reason why the COVID inquiry now has a role to play is in terms of establishing how that potentially could have been better handled, where that information that Dr Ranson is demonstrating was suppressed actually went to, and what obviously in the future should happen in national crisis of this nature in terms of the positioning of the medical director, their access to ministers, the amount of information that they should be presenting, and of course the level of command at which they should be sitting. Because, as I said, Mr. Speaker, the rest, obviously there is deep concern about the handling of the case, but fundamentally we have to get to the root causes. You don't tackle these types of incidents by focusing on cutting off a few leaves. If you're addressing a stinging nettle, you've got to pull it out by its roots. Root causes, fundamentally, the governance, the lack of governance, the lack of accessibility, the whistleblowing process are the critical elements that we must get to grips with, and of course we then subsequently want to ensure that the public do have confidence in the way that departments are conducting themselves in these judicial processes, and of course that the advice that has been provided is both correct and is also being interpreted correctly.
Question, Mr. Wallenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chief Minister alluded in his statement to saying that our people are our most prized assets, to which I agree. Dr Ranson was one such person. Has the Chief Minister given her an apology directly? And that surely would point to the changing culture, if he has. And if he hasn't, why not? Thank you.
Chief Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Honourable Member, I'm sure he did listen to my statement, will have listened very carefully to the very public personal apology that I've just issued to Dr Ranson.
Supplementary question, Mrs. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Chief Minister for his statement this morning, and I think he will be aware of how horrified the public has been at the findings of the hearing and the need to rebuild trust in the organisation, in the public administration and in government generally of this island. I'm curious, and I would like a distinction and a reassurance from the Chief Minister. He highlights there is already one review underway into COVID. He suggests he will bring forward to Tynwald an inquiry to look at the conduct of the department and through the liability hearings, but he stopped short of going to a public inquiry in both cases. Can he reassure that the information will be fully public? Why won't he go to public inquiry? Why should we have confidence that a review is going to adequately reassure the public on both the liability hearings, the tribunal and the conduct of the department through the legal proceedings, but previously the review into COVID generally? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chief Minister.
Well, I think I did lay out a Council of Ministers recommended recommendations in terms of the type of review that we believe is necessary, but of course we will have to do that by working closely with Tynwald. I merely point out it is of course entirely possible to have a full-scale public inquiry into this matter, but I do obviously point out the substantial cost, the likely trauma to individuals who may have already have been extended substantially through this whole process, and the need for them, indeed, in a public inquiry to give evidence. I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that our recommended view, and it is a view that the Council of Ministers has taken, is that this is quite a specialist area. There are clear and concise statements and points of failure that the tribunal has established. I point particularly to the most recent findings, where they state the case on liability was fought tooth and nail by the DHSC on a false basis to the substantial detriment of Dr Ranson and the expense of taxpayers on the Isle of Man. And the second paragraph, Ms Magson knew that the denials of liability in the response contained assertions and allegations that were untrue. She knew or should have known and understood that the way she had drafted the response was unsustainable. She knew or should have known that her pleaded arguments could never survive scrutiny once the documents which needed to be revealed were in fact disclosed. So this type of evidence is already there. I do not think there is much to be achieved by having a full public inquiry. I believe the core fundamentals of that are already exposed in the liability judgments, and that a proper terms of reference could be conducted for an independent review. My commitment, Council of Ministers' commitment, is to ensure that we all work as closely as possible, if indeed that is the way that Tynwald wishes to progress this matter.
Mrs. Christian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the conclusions of Dr Ranson's employment tribunal, this has understandably damaged confidence in government. Those are the Chief Minister's words a year ago. Is he absolutely, and taking upon a question from Mr Glover, is the Chief Minister, and he speaks on behalf of the Council of Ministers here today, is he sure that this independent inquiry will answer the substantive questions regarding the government performance and culture that has damaged the confidence in this government? Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Chief Minister, reply.
Well, Mr Speaker, I could equally suggest the same to the Honourable Questioner as to whether her motion would achieve that position. I think it is important, Mr Speaker, that at these times that there is clearly a role for Tynwald. Council of Ministers recognises the need to be at the primary point of addressing the culture and governance issues that have arisen, not just in this tribunal, but evidence in tribunals prior to that. We must all I would suggest to the Honourable Questioner be striving to ensure that the public service is operating at its maximum level of efficiency and efficacy and professionalism. And that means that we continue to review and look at these areas on an ongoing basis. I am confident, Mr. Speaker, that working together with Tynwald, we will establish and be in a position where confidence will be restored in terms of the advice that has been given to departments in the conduct of the employment tribunals. But we should not get distracted, Mr. Speaker, and I'll repeat this again, we should not get distracted from tackling the core roots of this problem, which fundamentally would mean that people do not end up in employment tribunals. My other point is that in terms of confidence, the fact that a tribunal has effectively heard the evidence, has reached its conclusions, has established many of the facts, I would say to everybody, is evidence of a robust judicial legal system.
Further question, Mr. Glover.
If you're reminded, Lord, will the Chief Minister ensure that within the terms of reference of this new inquiry that the Expol report is included, which to many stops short of being a full investigation?
Chief Minister's reply.
Well, I can't repeat myself enough, Mr. Speaker. Tynwald will ultimately judge the terms of reference, which will judge the terms under which the inquiry is conducted. So I'm sure the Honourable Member will have plenty of time to be able to be part of this and to express his opinion. And I'm sure that Tynwald may or may not wish to take a view on other matters. But I do point out that the tribunal in their findings, which I trust the Honourable Member has read in detail, do make a commentary on that, and I'll leave it up to him to make his own interpretation from that commentary.
Next question to the hands of Mr. Costa. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the Chief Minister for his statement this morning. And as the previous Health Minister, I would welcome that new inquiry into the part played by the Department during and throughout the tribunal. My only concern is, and my question to the Chief Minister is, does he actually have a timescale for when that report could be published if Tynwald supports it? Because we've got to think about everybody involved in this. We have to find a way forward. The longer that we continue to draw out this whole situation, the more pressure and the more it will affect those heavily involved in all of these decisions that have been taken over the last 18 months.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I expect that Tynwald will have a view, as will the Council of Ministers, in terms of timescales, and we will elucidate that when this matter comes to be discussed. I would suggest in the very near future in Tynwald.
Next question, Mr. Glover.
Good morning, Lord. I'd just like to pick up on the point the Chief Minister made in regards to the final cost of the taxpayer. Can the Chief Minister answer whether the tribunal award and any further investigation will impact on the future DHSC financial envelope?
Chief Minister's reply.
My understanding, Mr. President, is that Treasury will in fact pay for this out of their funds and will not come directly from the DHSC budget.
Final supplementary question, Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Chief Minister for the statement this morning and for spelling out what's happened. How confident are you that there are no equivalent situations currently in play under any department, under any minister or under any board at the moment?
Mr. Speaker, as I outlined before, I think it is impossible for any level of expectation in a workforce the size and scale of the Isle of Man government that there will never be cases. Again, what we have to do, Mr. Speaker, is try and ensure that these cases, when they arise, and I'm sure they are treated properly and professionally, that those who are being exposed to any nefarious behaviour have the proper whistleblowing access, that their concerns are treated properly and credibly, that proper advice is given in terms of law, process, application of that process to the respective line managers, to the respective individuals, and the matters are dealt with properly and professionally according to the appropriate standards, whether those be legal standards in terms of employment law, or whether they be standards that we're all expecting from our public sector, which are outlined in the government code and various other codes that have been put out to our workforce.
That concludes consideration of the urgent statement. For my part, I thank the Chief Minister for that, and in as much as I think it's preferable to have a statement before the House which is then subject to questions rather than doing things by press release. So anyway, thank you, Chief Minister.